The number one chess game of the 1970s is Fischer vs. Spassky, Game 6 of their 1972 World Chess Championship match. Now, I could have picked other Fischer games for this list. I could have picked other Fischer games for number one on this list, but for me, Game 6 stands out for its drama and its positional mastery. Now, we have to understand some context here. The 1970 to the 1972 period in Fischer's career is the most dominant period ever recorded in chess. It is possibly the most dominant period ever recorded by any sportsman in any sport. In 1970, in the Palma Interzonal, Fischer concluded the tournament with 6 consecutive wins against strong competition. You could argue for a 7th win, we'll get to that later, with a little bit of an asterisk. Now, after that, he advanced to the candidates' matches, the match cycle that would determine who would play in the World Chess Championship. He played Mark Taimanov and won 6-0. No draws, not 6-0 and a whole bunch of draws, which would have still been incredible. 6-0, no draws. In chess, no one before or since has done anything like that, except Fischer then did it again against Bent Larsen in the next match. 6-0, no draws. Absolutely incredible. In the final candidates match against former world chess champion Tigran Petrosian, he won 6.5 to 2.5. Which brings us to the World Chess Championship against the reigning champion Boris Spassky. Now, just getting Fischer to Iceland to play the match turned out to be a huge deal. It took convincing from friends, it took convincing through a phone call from Henry Kissinger, it took convincing through an extra $125,000 contributed directly to the prize fund by James Slater, and it took convincing in the terms of some monetary return for the TV rights for the broadcast. But ultimately, he did make it to Iceland. And then in game 1, he totally blew it. He blundered in a totally equal endgame, capturing a pawn trying way too hard to win, and he ended up losing the game. And then in game 2, probably more mad with himself than anything else, he threw basically a fit about the cameras and never showed up and forfeited that game. It's now 0-2. Now, he might never have shown up for game 3, and he could have forfeited right then and there, and the match would have been over. Maybe Fischer never would have played again. But Boris Spassky was a true sportsman and agreed to basically some ridiculous demands about the cameras, and Fischer did play. He won game 3. He won game 5. And now we reach game 6, in which Fischer puts on the board one of the finest positional dominating victories ever recorded in a World Chess Championship. Now, ordinarily, the first move of the game does not bear much comment in elite chess, but in this case, it certainly does. Fischer opens the game with 1c4, the English opening. Now, it was Fischer who said that 1e4 was best by test, and he had demonstrated that throughout his career, with excellent game after excellent game beginning with 1e4. This is almost the first time he's played the English opening. Why almost? Well, you remember how I said he won 6, maybe 7 with an asterisk games at the end of the Palma Interzonal? Well, in the 7th game, he was playing Grandmaster Pano. He opened the game with 1c4, and Pano never showed up, and Fischer won by forfeit. So this is his first time playing the move and expecting his opponent to make moves back. At this point, we see here pawn to e6, and actually, although we opened with the English opening by transposition, we're going back after d4 into a queen's pawn opening, a specialty of Spassky's. Knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, castles, pawn to e3, pawn to h6, the bishop falls back to h4, and b6, the Tartakover variation. At this point, we'll have a comment here from Oiva and Taman. This game has been thoroughly analyzed by many great players, and we'll reference where it makes sense comments by Tal, Oiva and Taman, Sarawan, Reshevsky, etc. And of course, we'll supplement that with my own thoughts and with computer analysis. So here, Oiva and Taman say, Spassky is fond of playing the Tartakover variation of the orthodox Queen's Gambit, and he rarely loses with it. It is interesting to watch how it is tackled by Fischer, who has no practical experience with this system. Now, why would Fischer go for an opening that his opponent knows so well and that he's never played in a serious game? Well, Fischer was always incredibly well prepared, and it may be that he had sensed an opportunity in one of his opponent's lines. It certainly seems that way as the players make a beeline for a theoretical position. The game continues, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, a trade happens on e7 here, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, rook to c1, bishop to e6, queen a4, pawn c5, queen a3, rook c8, and now bishop to b5. At this point, Mikhail Tal comments, "The American Grandmaster, as usual, is up to date with the latest theoretical information. In this way, Furman played against Geller in one of the army tournaments. White provokes the advance of the a-pawn, considering that this pawn can later prove to be vulnerable." Possibly without thinking about it too much, Spassky did follow the previous game and play pawn to a6 here. However, a significant later improvement was found. Douglas Griffin, a great translator, gives the following in his WordPress blog. He points out queen to b7, a huge improvement which has a lot of ideas, including just pawn to c4 here, because there is no longer a pin here to the queen on e7. Now, if you capture on c5, you can even win a pawn, but this is a bad idea because of knight to a6, a surprisingly strong move. Now, you can either capture on a6 as white or go for a queen trade, but both options are really good for black. The worst choice is capturing on a6 when after queen takes a6, you cannot castle and black is quickly mobilizing against your uncastled king. Black has a ton of pressure and may even be winning. Now, going for the queen trade is the better option, but after queen c6, black can trade queens and then play rook b8. Black is winning the pawn back thanks to the immediate attack on b2 and the idea of knight b4. And after winning the pawn back, black is going to be so much better developed, and this rook is really struggling, that black is much, much better. As a result, no one plays bishop to b5 anymore. However, that is with the benefit of hindsight. In the game, bishop b5 does happen, and Spassky plays pawn to a6. Now, if you pull the bishop back, which you don't have to do because there's a pin, black will have time to arrange pawn to c4 at some point. So you need now to capture on c5 and ensure that black has hanging pawns. Hanging pawns are an interesting strategic struggle. White is hoping to attack and blockade them and prove them very, very weak. That will happen in this game. On the other hand, black is hoping that the pawns can be strong, provide good central control, and maybe at some point advance, becoming maybe a pass pawn or otherwise unleashing some tactical possibilities. In the game after pawn takes c5, white castles now, and in this position there has been much discussion. Rook a7 is played, and Tal comments, "Geller also played this way in the above-mentioned game. Another possibility was queen to b7 with the transfer of the queen to b6. In this way, black rids himself of the pin, which at any rate in this game, caused him no little trouble." Now, Tal's proposed improvement of queen to b7 is also given by Reshevsky and others. However, Yasser Seirawan points out that bishop a4, also recommended by modern computer engines, maintains a small advantage. Instead, Seirawan recommends the move queen to a7, and again computer engines agree, and after bishop a4, pawn to a5, it seems that black has equality. Now, this is an analysis, a very nuanced analysis by the best players in the world and the best chess engines in the world. And honestly, I really struggle to tell the difference between these moves in some cases. We're really looking at very, very small differences in the scale of the advantage. However, this is the kind of chess that is played in the World Chess Championship. It's the kind of small edge that matters when you're talking about players like Fischer and Spassky. In any case, in the game, after rook a7, we now get the retreat bishop to e2 and knight to d7. Of course, this makes sense. This knight needs to develop. But the knight's development breaks the connection between the queen on a7 and the rook, between the rook on a7 and the queen on e7, and now there is a pin again. Fischer uses this opportunity. knight to d4, taking advantage of the pin to bring the knight to a great square where it can go to e6 or back to b3. At this point, Spassky made a significant error. He played the move queen to f8, and Tal comments, "In all probability, Spassky had underestimated the strength of White's 20th move. In my view, it was worth preferring knight to f6. In this case, the capture at e6 promises White little, while in reply to knight b3, Black can modestly continue knight to d7, although after rook c3, White's position is the more pleasant. Let's look at that. So after knight to f6 here, instead of queen to f8, there is knight b3, and the pressure here on c5 encourages c4. After queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and knight to d4, White is better, but not by so much. On the other hand, this is the kind of position that would be very unpleasant to defend against a great pressurizer like Fischer. And possibly Fischer would have won in this case as well after a long struggle. Now, after the move played in the game, queen to f8, Fischer has a 1-2 punch that is very positionally strong. I encourage you to pause your video and try to find it. Fischer's first move here is knight takes e6, and Oiva and Taman comment, "Of course, the move is also consistent with Fischer's style, who prefers the bishop over the knight in this type of position. Of course, Fischer is famous for that preference, possibly only Magnus Carlsen has as much of a preference for bishops over knights as Bobby Fischer. Now, of course, you have to recapture, and now pawn to e4. Only with great qualification can this be called a pawn sacrifice. It is clear that after pawn takes e4, one of the pawns on the e-file, if not both, will be picked off fairly quickly. White wants to liquidate the tension in the center in order to then occupy himself without hindrance on an attack on the sector of the board that has caught his eye. Of course, that is the king side. Now, instead of pawn to e4, you might consider here the move bishop to g4. I can see that this could tempt many players, but after bishop g4, this bishop is undefended, and that allows a critical tempo. After queen e7, pawn to e4 now, then there is knight to f6, hitting the bishop, and Black is able to equalize in this line. So, after pawn to e4, what should Black play? Well, possibly the best move. The move that modern computer engines recommend is the move that I and basically all analysts have rejected out of hand. It is the capture on e4. Now, in this position, Black's pawn structure looks ghastly. It's such a disaster that strong players really just don't want to consider this at all. But the modern computer analysis that values dynamism thinks that this isn't really much better for Fischer. So after this, the idea is that Black is gaining a lot of open lines and some critical access to some great dark squares that allows for sufficient counterplay. In fact, this reminds me a lot of Spassky's win against Fischer in the King's Gambit, where he also had a bad position at one point, but he got a lot of activity and really made it work. I can see Spassky making this work against Fischer. Now, after the capture on e4, we can consider a little bit of the lines. Sarawan recommends rook c4, but queen f5 is the engine response, and it doesn't seem so easy for White to make progress. Instead, the engine likes the move queen to e3, but then after queen to f5, White can play very aggressively with some ideas like f3, a true pawn sacrifice that is pretty dangerous. And after f3, you definitely don't want to take when rook takes f3 is a huge problem. The pressure here on e6 is crashing through, but if you don't capture on f3 and play the clever move knight to f6, then if White captures here, you can play queen e5. You've given the pawn back, but your queen is amazing now, and this bishop is no longer so impressive. White is only a little bit better here. Another idea after queen f5 recommended by the computers is pawn to g4, and I cannot imagine Fischer playing this way. I can imagine maybe Levon Aronian playing this way, but not Fischer. However, this is another line that the computer does like. In any case, White does have an advantage, but capturing on e4 is a modern approach that looks like the best available option for Black. In the game, what we actually get after pawn to e4 is the move pawn to d4. And Tal comments, Now the position takes on an all the more technical character and is all the more in keeping with Fischer's standard, the better position without counterplay for the opponent. Perhaps all chess players love such positions, but Fischer loves them in particular. I really think that the move pawn to d4 is positionally just the losing move. After this, I really don't see good options available to Spassky. Instead, queen to d6, defending passively looks better, although after a trade here on d5 and a move like rook to d1, and then rook e8, bishop f1, better than putting the bishop over on this diagonal when the bishop doesn't have anything to do after a later pawn to d4. You're much, much better as white, but are you winning? Maybe not yet. Certainly, this is more impressive than what happens in the game. After the move pawn to d4, Fischer continues with pawn to f4, and he's got a mobile majority here on the king side. Meanwhile, these pawns are blockaded and they are never going anywhere. Queen to e7 and pawn to e5. Tal says, first of all, white fixes the weak pawn at e6. Black's passed pawn is altogether inoffensive, while white's bishop is noticeably stronger than the enemy knight. White has in prospect an attack on the king's flank. So now we get the move rook to b8, bishop to c4, what a beautiful bishop, king over to h8, and queen to h3. This move is of course not difficult, but I really love the visual sweep of the queen sliding from one side of the board on a3 all the way over to the other side of the board on h3. Now, of course, rook takes b2 is not an impressive move. After you pick off this pawn, white can grab on e6 and knight f8, bishop c4. Again, these pawns are going nowhere. They are totally blockaded, but these pawns are quickly going somewhere. Again, dominating, winning for white. So after queen h3, knight f8, passive defensive e6, there is nothing better. And now pawn to b3, defending that pawn on b2 and just locking things up. Pawn to a5 and pawn to f5. Oiva and Taman comment, Black does not manage to create counterplay. The concluding part of the game may serve as a textbook example of an attack on the king. White's further play is simple, logical, and not in need of detailed commentary. Indeed, from this point to the end of the game, we will mostly be enjoying Fischer's dominance. There is not much chance for Spassky. Here, after pawn to f5, pawn takes on f5, rook takes on f5, knight to h7, rook over to f1, dominating the open f-file, queen to d8, queen to g3, rook to e7, and pawn to h4, restraining the knight on h7. You don't even need this move, but it is really great positional play. Now, rook b to b7, pawn to e6, the pawn is advancing and creating room for rook to f7 at some point. Rook b over to c7, queen to e5, queen to e8, and pawn to a4. Tal comments, to some extent characteristic of Fischer. He does not even leave Black the possibility such as a5 to a4. Admittedly, in the present situation, this would not have brought much. As Tal says, you don't even need to stop pawn to a4, but Fischer is just enjoying this position too much. He locks in and prevents any possible counterplay, celebrating the control that he has. Now we get queen to d8, rook to f2, queen to e8, rook up to f3, just shuffling, enjoying the position, queen to d8, and bishop to d3, queen e8, and queen e4. Of course, this move finally creates a huge threat. If you, for example, play rook over to b7 just to pick a move, the threat is executed, rook to f8, knight takes, and rook takes, and the queen comes into h7, and it is checkmate. Very pretty. So the knight must move off of h7, and it doesn't have anywhere to go, so it goes to f6, and rook takes f6. A pretty exchange sacrifice, but honestly a very simple one for a great player like Fischer. After pawn takes and then rook takes, the rook is obviously attacking h6, and there is no good way to defend that pawn. So king over to g8, bishop to c4, king back to h8, and queen to f4. In this position, Spassky resigns. The threats include rook to f8, probably the biggest threat, but also rook takes h6 or queen takes h6. There's just no holding on, and of course, Even if the immediate threats weren't decisive, black probably would be busted because these pieces are so passive, and these pieces and the big pawn on e6 are so strong and the king on h8 so exposed that you would be able to win in time, even if you weren't winning now. In any case, the resignation did hand Fischer the first lead he had in the match. He never looked back. Ultimately, he won 12.5 to 8.5. That was convincing enough, but if you think about kind of scratching off games 1 and 2, then this would be a 12.5, 6.5 victory. Sadly for all of us, Fischer would never play serious chess again, but he did leave a remarkable legacy of chess games. Now, if you want to see more of my favorite games of the 1970s, then click on the playlist that is sitting right on top of your screen.